my name is Valentina Ortiz. I'm from Argentina, but I'm currently living in Spain. And since 5 years ago, I dedicate myself in my YouTube channel to talk about men's issues, the men's rights movement, and to expose the abuse of the new age feminism. So I'm here to talk to you about the issues that Spain is going through. Spain is a feminist testing ground. If we had to use an analogy, Spain would be that small, isolated island where the most dangerous weapons are tested. It would be the lab in which medicines in development stage are tested, or it may be that small clandestine corner where criminals are trained. And these comparisons are not casual at all. In Spain, since 2004, a very peculiar law is enforced. Organic Law 1/2004. Of measures for comprehensive protection against gender violence, defining gender violence as any act of physical and psychological violence, including the aggressions against sexual freedom, threats, constraints, or the arbitrary deprivation of freedom. And it defines its aim as action against violence that, as a manifestation of discrimination, the situation of inequality, and the power relationship of men over women, it is inflicted to women from those who are or have been their husbands, or from who are or have been linked to them by similar relations of affection, even without living together. It is not by chance that it reads any act. So the Supreme Court established it with its jurisprudence, including the indefinite pronoun any. It is understood that it's not necessary to verify any specific purpose. This means that in Spain, the violence inflicted from a man to a woman has only one possible cause: gender. And this is the case even when women don't want it to be that way. And where does this take us? Among other things, to the fact that within the Twitter official account of the State Equality Minister, counts of the cases of women murders are carried out even when there is no confirmation on who has committed the murder. Also, to the fact that the very Canary Institute of Equality, an institution dependent on the Spanish state, published this year a release on how a gender violence case should be informed by the press. Among the guidelines that stand out are that there is no justification, no jealousy, no drugs, no alcohol, no poverty. It also points out there is never a dispute, not a family crime, it is only femicide or sexist violence. If we can read correctly all the information provided by the Spanish state, then what we understand is that for the Spanish law, any form of violence inflicted from a man to a woman is necessarily gender violence, and that no other criminological factors used to determine a crime motive are to be taken into account, and that, therefore, in all cases in which a situation of violence against a woman is interpreted, an aggravation of gender will end up being judged. While, if the gender was the opposite, the crime judgment would count with the possibility of more exhausting investigation taking into account all the factors that would lead us to understand the nature of the events. For the Spanish state, when a woman perpetrates a crime, this could be due to infinite factors: oppressive family structures, lack of education, poverty, addictions, religion, etc. However, when these very forms of violence are perpetrated by a man, automatically none of these are relevant, but the fact that the presumed aggressor is a man and the presumed victim a woman. This law restores without doubt the criminal law of authorship, in which the accused is not tried according to his delictive acts, but by the person he is and the group he belongs to. What would happen if these measures were applied to other groups? Imagine the absurdity and the social scandal that measures like this would arise if they were applied to African American people, or even easier, imagine that these measures were implemented only on women. In this particular case, for feminism, this would represent a clear example of institutional sexism. That's why the only way to turn this into positive is through the patriarchy theory. Women suffer structural violence for being women, and the men who possess all the privilege are their oppressors. Under this postulate, violating the constitutional principle of equality under the law becomes an heroic act. This law allows uneven sentences, and there are cases, which I will tell you about in this talk, being based on the freedom of going against the presumption of innocence. This law foresees as proof of charge the credible and non-contradictory testimony of the complainant only. From this law, immense irregularities come up, such as for prevention, the reported men are immediately put aside from their home until they pass through the courts. It is also curious that most of the complaints are made on Friday, which forces the reported men to spend the whole weekend in the police station, until court opens Monday. And it is also curious how none of these measures are taken into account with any other kind of crimes, not even with a child. And yes, it is also interesting to pay attention to the welfare benefits that the state grants to every woman who files an accusation through this law. The facilities offered to obtain complete custody of the children, and the very fact that even divorce attorneys recommend their women clients to make an allegation through this law to make their processes easier. More to the point, there are false allegation processing networks to be able to access Spanish citizenship. But even with all these into account, the district prosecution dares to declare that false allegations are only 0.01% of the total of complaints. This is so because despite what the law established, the court does not usually proceed ex officio when there are indications of false allegations, according to the 456 article of the Criminal Code. There is a study from the General Council of Judiciary titled Application of the Comprehensive Law Against Gender Violence by the Provincial Hearings. The judicial authorities select 500 cases for this study, which, according to them, are representative of all cases. In this study, from 500 complaints, 300 were appealed, while 200 sentences were sentenced in a single instance, from which 33% were only based on the victim's testimony. Only 2 of them were investigated as possible false allegations. Among the appeal complaints that weren't investigated as false allegations, there are such cases as this. A woman tries to kill a man during a trip by car. After this, she reports him for assault. The witness, who was driving the car while she was on the back seat, and the accused, the co-pilot seat, not only denies these facts, but also the very court ruled it as impossible that he had assaulted the victim from the place where they were seated. The very police agents who came to the scene at the moment of the events were witnesses of how the woman, upon arrest, started to hit herself inside the police car. The very police agents who came to the scene at the moment of the events were witnesses of how the woman, upon arrest, started to hit herself inside the police car so as to blame her partner later of the injuries that she herself had caused. She was charged with attempted murder, but she was never condemned for falsely accusing her partner, crime which, as the law in the Criminal Code, Article 456, states that it's mandatory to prosecute when signs of it are shown. Or another one, in which she reported that her partner had kidnapped her, assaulted her, and raped her. The psychological reports indicate that she doesn't show any sign of abuse, but that she has a theatrical drive and personality traits, with a great need of emotional support from others and a low tolerance for frustration. She herself later admits that her allegation was false. The very court warns her to be careful since she could be incriminating herself with a false allegation felony. Textual words of the sentence. She said that all she has previously said is a lie and that she made it up because she was furious since she wanted to get back together with him. None of these cases, as I stated, are among the only 2 cases that were prosecuted for possible false allegation. And in order to be able to show you the kind of reports that indeed end up in a sentence, I can also tell you the case of this couple that, after a party, had an argument for not being able to agree in when to actually leave the party. She punched him on the face, to which he replies with a slap. In response to the slap, she kicks him. Neither of them reports the other, nor present injuries. But even so, they end up in a violence against women court. He, charged with gender violence. She, with domestic violence. The judge, with good sense, seeing that it was mutual aggression and that neither of them had injuries, acquits them. The district prosecution, nevertheless, insists and appeals to the provincial hearing, which makes clear that, in this case, there is no point in applying Article 153 on gender violence because it has nothing to do with dominance, but with reciprocal confrontation. After this, they are again acquitted. The district prosecution appeals one more time, this time to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court finally charges the women with 3 months in jail and the men with 6, even when she was the first one attacking. Let's remember that Spain takes the testimony of the complainant as the only evidence for the prosecution. Spain makes effort in not investigating the false allegation so as to narrow down the number to the minimum. Spain, as many other countries, finance their social services against gender-based violence and opens new care centers, hires new professionals, and continue to create women courts according to the women affected by this issue. What would be the interest of thousands of people in losing their source of income if this entanglement were uncovered? And what would be the interest of the Spanish states that their funding by the European Union lowered? Therefore, how can we avoid, for instance, that a man abused by his partner is not being blackmailed so he won't report, under the threat that if he does, then he will be the one reported through the law of gender violence? So, Spain understands there is nothing to avoid because it is assumed that 1. Or men are never abused, or 2. Women are beings of light and capable of falling in human weaknesses such as lying for personal benefit. We confirm what the Spanish government interprets as gender violence when we consider that the surveys are carried out by the very state agents for equality and against gender violence, which is part of the Equality Ministry, to enlighten the topic of gender violence. In these surveys, women are asked if they have experienced situations of abuse, and men if they have been abusive. The results show that 16.9% of surveyed women have been victims of some kind of violence, while 6.3% of men claims to have been abusive. However, if we look at other surveys in which both genders are symmetrically asked, as the one in my example from the Queen Sofia Center, the data that emerged is that both genders are victims of gender violence in similar proportions, and that both genders are perpetrators of this same abuse in similar proportions too. The problem of how the criminal law of authorship is being established in Spain started in 2004, but until today, laws and proposed legislation are still promoted on the same line of deprivating men from their fundamental rights. In Spain, as I told you, there's a Ministry of Equality, which is determined to progress actively against men's rights and, even worse, on behalf of equality. In Argentina, my homeland, there's a very similar Ministry of the Women. But as I always say, this one at least is honest. Though paused by the COVID-19 pandemic, the law of sexual liberties was pushed forward. Among other things, this law, even if they don't have the courage of making it explicit, plans to reverse the burden of proof. It will be the accused who will have to prove the absence of offense, instead of being the complainant and her defense who should prove the existence of it. What do I mean when I say that they don't have the courage of stating it explicitly that is proposed to reverse the burden of proof? Well, just because of the simple fact that only yes can mean yes, and all the rest, in consequence, is no. It is to say, if one given night you meet a girl, there is connection and you both decide to finish the night in the house of any of the two, and for the reason it may be, shame for her sexuality, guilt for betraying a possible partner, family, the following morning she regrets and she decides to report you through this law. So then, it will be you, the one who, unless you have a written consent that would determine from what exact second until what exact second she consented in the intercourse, you, that if you don't count with a video of the whole intercourse in which the complainant can be seen and heard clearly saying, yes, I consent, so it will be you who will have to have a witness to testify the veracity of your words. This last, clearly, is very difficult within intimate relationships among adults. Because for this law, only yes means yes. And that was precisely the slogan with which they sold the law to the Spanish population. Only yes means yes. Carmen Calvo, in her position as Minister of Equality, proposed to reform the criminal code so that all sexual intercourses without an explicit consent were considered rape, based, according to her, on the modifications done by Sweden and Germany about sexual assault, ensuring that these modifications were done under the premise of only yes means yes. And, like this, the Spanish authorities lie us on video, ensuring that this reality we are now living in Spain is not a dystopic one, but that is the rule and that is how we should act under the law. The Swedish and German reforms, however, do not come even close to the story told by our minister. The Swedish judge Anna Hanel, one of the creators of the Swedish reform, clearly established that there is no need for explicit consent, and the German reform goes even farther, since previous to this reform, no action was considered nor as rape, neither as sexual assault, unless the situation in which the woman has opposed physical resistance, even if she had yelled no during the whole intercourse. The only way in which the German law is harder than the Spanish one is in the expedition of immigration procedures onto those immigrants who had committed this kind of crimes, a measure which is not applied in Spain in any way. And to me, it is important to show you this is not an isolated case. It is not the case of a group of teenagers expressing their particular point of view on social media. The case is that these ideas are the core of feminism in Spain. The state, the justice, and their representatives to these days are the ones in charge of making follow this agenda. On the same page, there is also the position taken by Temis Women Lawyers, an association linked to the ruling party, that proposes to reverse the burden of proof in Spain. This is an association composed by women judges. They know what they are talking about. How come they defend a measure that not only goes against the Constitution, but also against the very universal Declaration of Human Rights? Another example. Well, Lidia Falcón, president of the Feminist Party in Spain, already suggested in several occasions that for this type of crimes, the burden of proof should be reversed. To this point, any person with a little empathy for human beings and minimally aware of the importance of ensuring respect for constitutional warranties should be feeling a mixture of astonishment and outrage. But the icing of the cake are the aids that this law is expected to offer. Financial aids equivalent in quantity to the unemployment subsidies, aids to study, benefits to help find employment and access to housing. Benefits which also offer the comprehensive gender violence law, that one I was talking a little ago. The difference, in this case, the law doesn't seem to consider necessary a sentence in a court of law. It is enough that an authorized organism certifies you have been a victim of some of this. It could be the same social and health services, reception centers, a report from the police authority, or a report from the Ministry of Taxation. Even the very same labor inspectors when the alleged abuse occurs in the work environment. But again, I go even farther and I wonder why Article number 31 of this law states clearly that all these measures has women as sole objects. Why all these measures against abuse are not offered to men? Again, we have to read the intentions of the Spanish states, and we will see that this understands that 1. Men are never abused, or 2. Being raped for a man is less traumatic, less heartbreaking, and less humiliating than it is for women. When, in fact, we know it is exactly the way around. If it is already difficult enough for a woman to deal with rape, imagine when you belong to the disposable gender. Imagine how complicated it must be for a man, forced into the role of supplier and protector, who was taught that he must be strong and manly and not allowed being abused. We know that for men, it is infinitely more difficult to report a situation like this, and you will agree with me that these conditions only reduce the numbers of cases that we know of male abuse. Even with all that, in Spain, there are 80 rapes and 1,000 sexual assaults in which the victims are men for a year. So this gives the answer to our former question. Spain does know that men are victims of sexual assault. Then we are left to conclude that Spain believes that when this heartbreaking experience is lived by a man, it becomes automatically less serious. Because of this kind of laws, we have two kinds of consequences. Those which affect other legal provisions, measures, selection and evaluations of the state, or even in the tax charges of different jobs or activities. And second, the direct consequences in Spanish men's everyday life. The first group of consequences is possible thanks to the previously established basis by this type of laws. That framing the problem in a feminist government, as the officialism of the Spanish government defines itself, allows certain things as these, and I will name them quickly for you to be able to have an idea about the magnitude of the measures imposed daily in Spain since years ago on the name of equality, but to the detriment of men. The autonomous community of Andalusia puts men in a disadvantage on the admission tests for public employment, where already 64% of it is represented by women, by choosing the women in case of a tie. The Spanish government offers bonuses in the quotas of self-employed, financial bonuses only for women. I, as a woman in Spain, have more possibilities to start a business than a man my same age. Spain gives extra public financial benefits only to women. Spain counts with an economic system that spends a great part of the social funds to programs and talks exclusively for women. Spain, as we mentioned at the beginning, differently to how it should proceed, doesn't investigate ex officio and condemns as gender violence any kind of violence from a man to a woman linked by emotional relationships, present or past, only with mere testimonies, enlarging the number of gender violence victims and artificially shortening the number of false allegations just to defend the effectivity of unconstitutional laws. Spain, in each given opportunity, reminds women that they are in a great risk of social exclusion and proposes plans and programs to fight them. Nevertheless, and here we come to the second group of consequences, men represent 86% of homelessness in Spain. There are campgrounds in Spain that became actual residences for divorced fathers who, after unfair trials, end up not only deprived of their most fundamental rights, but also of the very goods that guarantee their dignity. These men, after their divorces, can't access a home, reason why most end up in these campgrounds, in their parents' home, or living in their cars. This is a reality very well known all over the world. And the Spanish government claims that who are in risk of social exclusion are women. 95% of work-related deaths in Spain are men. 74% of suicides in Spain are men. In Spain, occur more than 300 international parental abductions per year, mainly perpetrated by women. Infinitely more cases than the one documented as gender violence. What are the aids established for men? None. While in the same name of equality, the Spanish justice determines endless benefit for women, while denying and making invisible the problematics and issues of men, letting them vulnerable and lonely. It is determined that the justice is patriarchal and that discrimination and institutional and structural oppression are only against women and never against men. Without having into account, of course, that all men's issues around the world are getting worse within the state that only perceives them as oppressors and never as possible victims of any kind of violence. Paternity flaws, custody fights, absence of reproductive rights, masculine disposability, lack of resources for abused men, men's health issues, sexual assault, and the lack of resources for acknowledgement and reporting that are so present in Spain. Little more than 2 months ago, immersed already in the COVID-19 crisis, a project was taken to debate non-bill of gender violence denial. A non-bill project in Spain is used to obtain information about the possibilities of becoming a draft law. It was voted unanimously. This draft law, which literally urges the government of Spain to fight sexist or denial gender violence speeches. This law, to sum up, proposes the ability to condemn whoever dares to question whether a case is gender violence, even counting with the fact that the Spanish law is the only one which understands gender violence as all acts of violence from a man against a woman that are linked to each other by a couple or ex-couple relationship. Among the horrifying things in this law, it is that it makes punishable the criticism against the comprehensive gender violence law, which we saw before is unconstitutional, or that it could be punishable to understand the absurdity that it comes from considering that all violence in a couple is given because of a gender motive. In the very same debate of this law, the ones who defended the aforementioned draft dare to question the Istanbul Agreement which acknowledges that gender violence may also be suffered by men, and that states that for something to be considered gender violence, there must be a gender motive, and not just from one gender to another, as the Spanish law understands it. On the same page is the United Nations, that defines as gender violence the one that occurs because of gender motives, and states that all women, men, boys, and girls can be victims of it. We could think that the solution to this problem is merely educational, that is enough to instruct women in not being abusive on these measures to enable a correct functioning of them. even when our own state, our own media, and the very Spanish feminists consider in their majority that is no malfunctioning on these laws and measures. But, to start with, that is the very same concept of justice that we've been applying for years. It will simply be enough to instruct the population in not committing crimes, but under that same rule of thumb, there would be no need of gender violence law or interfamily violence law or laws in general. But in reality, the point is that we cannot start assuming that everybody has good intentions, the same way we cannot assume that everybody has bad intentions, as it is done with men. That is why, at some point of our existence, we started considering the judicial system to be the best method we have to this moment, in which the acts are judged, not the person. Or at least, this was the case until the gender laws came up. In Spain, in all aspects, everything is based on the assumption that between two contradictory stories, the woman is more declined to be telling the truth, while the man will be more declined to be lying. That is how we end up assuming an original sin, selecting what words have more value according to who says them. At present, I am working as a media ambassador for the case of Carlos Salgado. His case is very famous here in Spain. Carlos Salgado met during vacations in St. Petersburg the one person who would become his nightmare. They started a relationship and, being her of Kyrgyz origin, they went to live in Spain. In 2008, they had their daughter, Carolina. Briefing up, Carolina, who is already 12 years old, was abducted by her mother 4 years ago and taken to Kyrgyzstan. It is a case of international parental kidnapping. After the divorce, they agreed on a regime in which the mother would have the custody, by recommendation of Carlos' lawyer, but in which both parents would have access to 50% of the time with the girl. Little by little, the mother, using different excuses, started to shorten the father's time with her daughter, until she wanted to take even the last weekday the father had with the girl. Carlos, not resignating himself to be an uncle daddy, situation in which he would see his daughter few days a month on the weekends, decided to go to the court for the mother's failure to comply with the visitation regime. What did the mother do? She applied the silver bullet. She falsely accused Carlos for sexually abusing her own daughter. The complaint was dismissed. After reiterating mother's disobedience to the judge and the social services, Carlos warned in more than 3 occasions by written that he saw a strong possibility that the mother would try to leave the country with the girl. He was ignored. They assumed this could never have happened without the father's authorization, but, as we all know, it is socially understood that the child belongs more to the mother than to the father, so this happened anyways. Having the court dismiss all Carlos' warnings, the mother took the girl to Kyrgyzstan, a country that is experiencing serious political tension right now, in which even the parliament got fired, and moreover, a country in which the Hague International Agreement of 1980 against international minors abduction has no value. When the mother kidnapped her own daughter, the judge, with good sense, gave the full custody and the exclusive and total paternal authority to Carlos, while issuing an international search and arrest warrant to the mother to be interrogated in Spain. As the Hague International Agreement is not effective in Kyrgyzstan, it is needed the collaboration of the Kyrgyz justice for the Spanish sentences to be applied, and this is done by a requisitioning commission that the judge on the case must send to a Kyrgyz judge. However, there was a change of judges in the case, and the new judge, I really wouldn't want to think that she acted the way she did for being a woman, but I suspected it, decided to not send the requisitioning commission because, simply and in her own words, it was not her criteria. Clearly, this is not an educational issue, because we wouldn't even consider right that so-called mothers claim to love their children but are capable of denying them the right to the love of their fathers because of their own resentments and personal misgivings. This is a fact of reality. There are mean women, and we cannot leave justice in the hands of fate. The only and really optimal solution to this inequality and legal asymmetry it is to discard all these laws and proposals that vulnerate the principle of equality and no discrimination, Article number 14 of the Magna Carta, when criminally discriminating men. It would be enough to admit that these measures are counterproductive even for the real women victims, since the case of so-called gender violence hasn't decreased in Spain, but increased. It would be enough to understand that before these gender laws, there were other laws that protected both victims equally, and that men who abused a woman was already defined as a criminal. It would be enough to arrive to the intuitive conclusion that clearly this is not allowing us to protect a wider group of people. On the contrary, it's succeeding in leaving half of the population unprotected, while the other half gets all the privilege in forms of positive discrimination. No law against abuse will be successful if under this law it is okay to abuse half of the citizens with immunity. And maybe the comparisons seem a little ambitious, maybe even uncomfortable. But being this very same model of justice, the one of the criminal law of authorship, the one used in the Nazi Germany, it is easy to understand why the term feminazi has been coined. The bad thing is that these kind of things started happening since a long time ago in different parts of the world. The good thing is that it's not too late to pay attention and put the word out, so this won't become the norm in the judicial and criminal systems in the Western world. And this implies becoming their pain in the ass. And we will. Me, at least. It's been 5 years since I've made the decision of becoming that pain in the ass. And of course, I am determined to do it. Thank you so much for giving me your time. My name is Valentina Ortiz and you can find me on YouTube as Entropía de Valen. And possibly you can also find me soon on my new channel I'm working in, Balance Entropy, where I'll try to start my work as a communicator, but this time in English. You can always contact me through valentina@laentropiadevalen.com. Thank you so much.